Up to the point in time, we've been looking at Abraham through to his sons. So Terah, the father of Abraham, he had 3 sons, Nahor, Haran and Abram, of course, who became Abraham. Now, from those sons, Haran gave birth to a son called Lot, Abraham's nephew, Milcah and Iscah, and Nahor had a large number of children. Quite funny names, some of them Uz or Buz, but they're probably pronounced Uz and Buz. Chesed, Hazo, Kemuel, Pildash, Jidaph, Bethuel, Laban, who we know well in the Bible, who we're about to enter into his story. And then, of course, we have Laban's children and wives, etc. So we've got Rebecca, Leah and Rachel, so they're all from that side of the family. So they descended from Abraham's brother Nahor. And of course from Abraham, we have the 2 children who we've been looking at, and that's Isaac and Ishmael. So last week we had a focus on Ishmael. Ishmael has 12 descendants who are listed on this list, and they form the many tribes which populate northern Arabia basically today in the Syrian desert. Now from there, Isaac had 2 children, Jacob and Esau, whom we're just about to enter into their story. And of course Jacob has the 12 sons who become the 12 tribes of Israel. With Isaac, he was the promised child of the covenant through which, from Abraham, we would have the descendants through to King David, and of course through to Jesus. So there's a couple of scriptures I'm just going to read to you from the book of Luke, just to sort of preface this next part of this journey. The first scripture is from Luke 1:26 to 27, and it says, "In the 6th month, God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth, a town in Galilee, to a virgin pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of King David. The virgin's name was Mary." Now the other scripture is also from Luke, and it's chapter 1, this time verses 31 to 33. And it says, "You will be with child and give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High God. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever. His kingdom will never end." So when you listen to those 2 scriptures, what are the significant people that those 2 scriptures are mentioning? Because they're actually connecting Jesus, going back through this journey, through to Abraham. So there's some people here who are very significant because in the genealogy of Jesus, it talks about going from Abraham to King David and then through to Jesus, doesn't it? But it has a more specific pathway which is revealed as we go along. And one of those specifics is actually that it will actually come through the house of Jacob. Okay? So here we are, we're looking at Isaac tonight. And Isaac will have 2 children, one of them will be Jacob and one of them will be Esau. So we see the fulfilment of the covenant coming through these scriptures. The significant part that we must remember when we're reading the Old Testament, though, is that all of the genealogy that's been followed, all of the people through the Bible, it's actually fulfilled in the New Testament when we read the genealogy of Jesus. So the message here is really clear, and it says that Jesus will be born from the flesh from a virgin mother called Mary. He will descend from Jacob through the descendants of King David. So Abraham's grandson Jacob was set apart from his other descendants, and his name was changed to Israel. So this is the part of the Bible we're about to enter, so we have some name changes. So God's covenant, promised first with Abraham, who was known as a Hebrew, was then renewed with Jacob, whose name became Israel, and his descendants then became known as the Israelites. Same people, same bloodline, but we have this name change. The Israelites were promised the land of Canaan for their own, But their kingdom in the future, as we go through this journey, will be split in two, and a line of Abraham's descendants, who are listed in the genealogy of Jesus, will settle in the southern kingdom of Judah and become the forefathers of Jesus. Being from the land of Judah, or Judea as it later became known, these Israelites then became known as Jews. And of course today we know them as the Jewish people. So the point is that the genealogy ties what we know as Jewish people to what was formerly known as Israelites, to what were formerly known as Hebrews in the Bible. So we understand then that those different name changes doesn't mean different people, it just means that the recognition, the name that they're recognised by has actually changed with time. And of course, the kingdom of Judah will be derived from the son of that name, and of course Judah is actually the fourth son of Jacob, not the first one who would normally take the inheritance. So we're going to be following this path. So with Isaac, like his patriarchal father Abraham, he's a forefather of the Israelites, so he became before the name was changed to the Israelites. He marries his first cousin Rebecca, who is on this genealogy page that I've just given you, and which I'll post online. And it's Abraham's niece by his brother Nahor. And he was married for 20 years before he has children. So he has a story which becomes a little bit similar to that of Abraham and Sarah, but he doesn't take the same path to have a resolution, and that's where it changes. In Genesis 22, verse 2, God tests Abraham and he says, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." So my first question is, where is Moriah? Everyone know where Moriah is?
Israel?
No? It's in Israel, it's a good start. A little bit more specific. Where's Moriah?
I'm trying to think. Yes, I just can't remember where it was now.
On Moriah, Mount Moriah is where the threshing floor of Aruna was. Where's the threshing floor of Aruna? That was during the time of King David, when he purchased the land to build the temple upon. So where are we? We're in Jerusalem. So Mount Moriah, where Abraham went to actually potentially sacrifice Isaac, where he was asked to take this test, was actually in the very same place where Jesus was sacrificed. So we actually see in this story almost a repetition of what happens or what's to come much, much later. And we actually see the Christ-like nature of Isaac because he actually goes to the cross, so to speak. He lays on the wood of the altar. Okay, so we're going to understand that connection with Isaac. This story, it's often told from a perspective of Abraham. You know, how Abraham was tested because he was asked to sacrifice his son. But imagine being Isaac, because Isaac was being asked to voluntarily lay on an altar and be sacrificed, but with the knowledge that somehow he had to survive in order that the fulfillment of the covenant would happen, which was to come through him. So there would be a lot of things that would be coursing through his mind at this point in time as well.
But did he know at that point?
But he didn't know in the beginning, no. But when he got close to where the place was, he started to figure out there was something going a little bit skew with, a little bit wrong, wasn't there? So,
no,
so
what I mean is that he didn't know about Jesus there. So you say a lot of things go in his mind.
Well, I didn't say that he would know or not know about Jesus, but that's one of the questions I will ask you. Right? Didn't we say last week that when Jesus was questioned in Galatians, we had the reference there that said, what did it say? It said that
Abraham, I was.
right, before Abraham I am.
I am, yeah. Great.
Remember that God revealed himself to Abraham.
Yes.
Right? The name Jesus it means God the Saviour. Okay. So we have this connection that's coming through with all of this. So this is a very interesting time part of the Bible. He settled at Beersheba in the land of the Philistines, protected by a treaty made with Abimelech, who was the king of Gerar. So he was the Philistine king that we spoke about last week. Time passed peacefully. He had plenty of land for his herds and flocks, and he enjoyed life while he watched his son Isaac grow and mature, until one evening his tranquility was shattered with the most severe trial that God had ever placed before him. Remember, we talk about other trials that Abraham had. You know, you have the trials of being called out. Do you have enough faith to actually leave her and go? Then from Haran, do you have enough faith to leave your father and family and go? And then the drought, he went down to Egypt, right? So there was all of these tests that were actually before him. But this is the biggest one, because we're in the natural, we're challenging people by saying, would you sacrifice your own son? And remember, when we looked at all the idols, people in societies all around him were actually sacrificing their children. So that was happening, that was around Abraham, and yet he was being challenged by the very thing that God said that you are not to do. And yet God's asking him to do this now.
Yeah.
So we can ask ourselves the question, do you think that Abraham understood that God was testing him and he needed to be obedient? Or do you think he actually expected that he would actually have to sacrifice his own son? You see, he knew that the covenant would pass through Isaac. So these sort of questions are the sort of things that we can ask about these circumstances, and these are the things that you could expect running through the mind of them at the time. You know, when you're asked to do something significant and it goes against your will probably, or against your natural feelings that, you know, you love your son and you don't want to kill them, and yet you're being asked by the Lord to do so. So he was commanded to sacrifice his son. In the future, his descendants will act with deep religious fanaticism to sacrifice their firstborn in the hope of appeasing an angry God. But this was abhorrent to the Lord. So what we're talking about is the future descendants, which we read about in the genealogy of Jesus amongst the kings. Some of them actually sacrificed their sons to the fire, you know, to these gods we were talking about, like Melech last week. Okay? So here he is being tested with this, and it will actually happen in his own bloodline descendants in the future before the time of Jesus.
Yeah.
So of course this is abhorrent to God. So once again there's that check and balance, is there? How can you do something so abhorrent and be asked by God to do this? So could God really expect him to do such a thing? And if so, how will the covenant be fulfilled? So Abraham was about to embark on a trial that would make his own faith perfect. The ultimate test. Will he sacrifice his son? Why do you think I say make his own faith perfect? Why do you think I say that? Why will it perfect his faith?
Because there's no other test, is there, really? It's more than that, that's it. And it's, you know, similarities with Jesus Christ dying on the cross.
Yeah.
Although Isaac wasn't killed and came back, but I would imagine that would have been going through Abraham's head at the time, that if I do kill him, he's got to come back.
Right.
So
right.
he believed that he would come back if he
Right.
killed him.
So this is that first challenge, because we're talking about if he's killed,
Yes.
then there must be a resurrection, because the covenant has to be fulfilled.
Yeah.
So he must understand that even if he kills him in the natural, that he will live again.
Yeah.
Or the other option is that he'll be put to the test, but he won't actually have to do it. There are only two options that can be in his mind. Sebi, you've got a question?
That
An answer?
God's testing him to see if he would actually do it, to see if he has faith in him.
Absolutely, but we're talking about perfecting his faith.
Mm.
The fact is that... Sorry, Tim, did you...
Well, I was going to say, you know, sometimes we think, is that God? Do you think that will be going through his head?
Well, he has met with God, and he has spoken with
No,
God,
no,
and he has been
but I
talking
mean,
with God.
Yeah,
So
so he's relationship with God must be at the point where he knows without a doubt that it's God talking to him.
Right. I believe so. I don't believe that's the issue here. But I think the perfecting of his faith ultimately means that he has to have faith that even though God's asking him to do this, that his son is going to live and have children in order for the covenant to be fulfilled. Because Abraham's whole promise was that all these things would happen, but most of them weren't for him while he was alive, they were actually for later on, weren't they?
Yeah.
So here he is now being asked to do yet another thing, which is actually now about his son, and whether his son survives, it'll affect what happens later on. But he's been asked to do the actual action.
God giving up Jesus too.
Right, that's right. We have a direct analogy between
Yeah.
the father and son
And
here.
Abraham.
That's right. And this is where we have that duopoly that we're looking at, where the test is always talked about, usually in teaching about Abraham, but boy, oh boy, what a test for Isaac.
Reflecting also Jesus.
Oh, that's right. This is exactly right. So meekly Abraham submitted to his father's will. In Genesis 22:3 it says, "Early the next morning Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about." So it's making it clear here that it was God, and it's also making clear that he's actually going to offer him as a burnt offering. So it's not just a death, it's actually a death by fire. So it's quite specific. Now in Matthew 5:5, it says, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." So the meaning for this is that blessed are the spiritually strong. You see, when we're meek, we're not weak. When we're meek, it's because we're spiritually strong. Normally the people who are aggressive in life or trying to control things are probably more spiritually weak and more physically strong. But if we're spiritually strong, we actually can be physically meek. In other words, we don't need to prove ourselves, do we? So meekness is when we have self-control. You know, we're okay with being small. We're okay with being perhaps less significant because our identity isn't in what's around us. Our identity is in the Lord. Okay. So when Abraham was doing this, remember he was one person called out of society. He was called out of the world, he was called out of his family, he's travelled through this land, but he's just an ordinary man. He wasn't a king, he wasn't anything else. So there would have been a meekness to Abraham because he's been called to do this huge journey, and yet he's just this normal person, if you will. So when God puts something like this on you, which is really huge, it would make you feel even smaller and insignificant, wouldn't it? Okay, so the question I was asking before was, so where was this mountain in the region of Moriah that Abraham was told to take his son? There's many suggestions for the location are in Jerusalem. There's also some suggestions about it being near Shechem, so this is different people who've done different studies a bit further north, and also in the land of the Amorites. But as usual, the answer is always to be found where? In the Bible. We need to know our Bible. So we go to 2 Chronicles chapter 3 verse 1. It says, "Then Solomon began to build the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David. It was on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, the place provided by David." So the Bible gives us all the answers. The place where Abraham was to sacrifice Isaac was the threshing floor which he purchased. The threshing floor was on Mount Moriah. So that means that the temple of Jerusalem, where it is today, is the very spot where Isaac was asked to be sacrificed by his father Abraham. A significant place. The same place. Okay, so as we always talk about, you know, God's house, God's place is very specific. So everything that God's asking and commanding them to do actually is very connected. Right? And this is one of those great illustrations. But once again, the story that we're reading now is in Genesis, but the answer to the question is actually in 2 Chronicles. So if we don't read our Bible in totality, then we're going to fall short in understanding. Okay? Now, I had a fellow in the last couple of days online who's been contesting teaching about Paul, you know, in various books. And part of the problem that happens is that same thing where people are talking about, oh, we don't need to know about the law, in other words, the Old Testament. Well, my understanding is that God's laws are God's laws, so I think they're pretty significant. But the problem is that we have people who are determining what parts of the Bible are relevant, and they want to sell this story that the gospel's an easy gospel and we don't need to worry about all that stuff. Right? Our faith is very simple, but what God has to say to us is not complex, but it is a journey that goes across thousands of years. So the Bible has a lot to say. It tells us that no matter what people were walking at different generations, that they failed to come to the Lord, hence why Jesus came. Okay, so I have a map here, which again I'll put online. So I'll just pass it around. So this actually shows you from Beersheba, where he was living, up the way to Shur. Again, in Hebrew, we were just being taught this on Sunday night, Monday morning in my class, that there's no such thing as the name road, highway or whatever in Israel or in Hebrew. It just is the way. So we call it today, when we go down a road, we call it the highway. Right? It's a derivative from these days, but they used to just call it the way. So all the roads in those days were the way to Shur, the way to this, the way to that. If you look at Beersheba going up to where Jerusalem is, there's only a couple of towns in between. So they would have gone to one, stopped the night, gone to the next, stopped the night, and then gone to the next, which would make sense for a traveller in dangerous times, that they would stay somewhere safe where there was a township. Okay. So, going on from there, so Abraham knew what we now know as a much larger Jerusalem. In these days, they were inhabited by people called the Jebusites, and it was actually called Salem, hence the combination of that name that became Jerusalem. But back then it was called Salem. And it was much smaller. Okay, so in Genesis 14 verse 18, it says, and Melchizedek, who was king of Salem, was not only a king who ruled over the Jebusite people, but he was a priest of God Most High. So this is one of those things I was speaking about the previous week, where does God actually speak to other people, or do other people know God? Well, this tells you that here he was a priest of the God Most High. So we know from this that God was actually in communication with others. We know when he went to Gerar, there was an incident obviously with his 90-year-old wife, and God released him. We know when he went down to the Pharaoh, when his wife was 16, he was released. So obviously God's presence is known in these ancient times. And it says that this Melchizedek, the priest, blessed Abraham, and whom Abraham tithed in return a tenth of everything. It says that in verse 20 of Genesis 14. So he gave a tenth of everything he had to this king, this priest. So the Holy Bible says Abraham took Isaac to be sacrificed at Jerusalem, the place where King Solomon built the temple over the threshing floor of Araunah. In the time of Abraham, Mount Moriah was its former name, and it was next to, but outside of, the ancient but smaller city of Salem. And when you go to Jerusalem, you see that it had stages of building, like any city. It starts off a certain size, when it expands, and suddenly the locations can obviously vary. So the threshing floor is a place where they would take the harvest and they would thresh the wheat. Okay, so it was obviously not in the middle of town, it was something that was being done outside of the town walls. So we know that it was outside of the then city at the time. So Isaac went with his father Abraham northwards for Beersheba. So at this point in time, Isaac's been told to get his gear, and we're going for a wander up to Mount Moriah. We've got the donkey, we're going to make a sacrifice, we've got the wood, and we're taking a couple of servants to help us out. So that's what all he knows at this point in time. The terrain would change obviously as they go up the highway. They went from Beersheba, which is on the edge of the desert, and then they're going up into the high country. So they would have had this gradually increasing walk. As the map shows you there, they passed through a place called Kiriath Arba, as it was called. That's in Hebron today. They would have rested for the night in the protection of the city walls. Isaac would have woken early in the morning to continue his journey north. Remember, we're following the journey of each descendant here, so we're in Isaac's story right now. So rising with the two servants, the donkey would have been loaded with wood again. His father led them further north across the hill country because his father was told, this is where I want you to go. So he's taking him where he knows the Lord wants them to go. So they would have had an arduous day. Come the rest of the next protected town, which was much smaller than Kiriath Arba, and it was called Bethlehem, as it was called in those days. That's right. Right. The future place, birthplace of Jesus, the house of bread, the future land of the future town of the inheritance of the forefathers of Jesus itself. So they would have stayed there on the second night, and of course this is close to their destination. It's about 16 k's up the road from there. Okay, so early on the third morning, the Bible says they set out, and on Genesis 22:4 it says, on the third day Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. So they were close to the city of Salem, but his father didn't lead them inside, for he was heading towards a small peak outside the city walls, a place that God led them to. Isaac's father said to the servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you. Genesis 22 verse 5. So of course you can just keep following this as I'm talking the story. It's all from the Bible. So Isaac would have stood, and his father would have put this bundle of wood off the donkey's back and placed it on his shoulder. Isaac, we established, was about 15 years old. Nice strong lad. Abraham at this stage is about 115. So it's like, here son, you can carry the wood. Okay, so I've got a nice picky here of what that probably would have looked like. So we'll post this as well and pass it around and have a look. But if you look there, you see that Abraham's got a little basket that he's carrying. What do you think he's got in his basket? He's got his tools for making the tinder to start the fire. Okay. So Isaac stood while his father took this bundle of wood and placed it on his shoulder. His father picked up the knife and the tinder to start the fire, as the picture shows, and they went up the slope without the servants. As Isaac trudged upwards, he obviously started to get to the point where he's a little bit suspicious there's something a bit different to normal going on here. So in verse 7 of Genesis 22, it says, the fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? He's asking his dad. So his father simply answered that God would provide. So he's obviously not telling him the whole truth or the whole story at this point in time. He trusted him. Isaac trusted his father, and they went on together. So arriving at the place God had led Abraham to, he built an altar and arranged the wood on it. This of course would be normal for Isaac, wouldn't it? Because he would have learnt from his father that when his father goes to communicate with God, that he would usually build an altar, pitch a tent, and then he would pray to the Lord. So here he thinks, well, here we go again. The only thing is the servants aren't carrying the wood and they've got no animal. So obviously something's different. So there was no ram. As his father approached him, it dawned on Isaac that he was the sacrifice. As shocked and scared as he was, however, Isaac did not try to run away from his elderly father when God's command was revealed to him. He trusted his father, and he obviously trusted the Lord. Isaac submitted himself, so you can imagine with his heart pounding, he allowed his father to bind him and put him on top of the altar. When they sacrificed animals, they used to bind them. Right? So Isaac was literally bound like an animal. So you can imagine the submission. He's standing there and saying, okay, Dad, time out, I'm going to climb up on top of this wood on the altar.
Like Jesus.
Right, so we see that very direct connection, don't we?
To the wood.
So we say to ourselves, you know, can this really happen? Didn't they both realise that Isaac's death meant the covenant wouldn't be fulfilled? So we need to understand that this test was not just for Abraham, but was also for Isaac. Isaac could easily resist his elderly father, but he chose not to. For he too needed to prove to God that his faith was perfect. You see, neither of them believed the covenant wouldn't be fulfilled, for they both reasoned God could raise Isaac back to life from the dead. Isaac was Christ-like in his willful submission. This answer can be found, funnily enough, in the book of Hebrews. So again we go to the New Testament. So in Hebrews chapter 11 verses 17 to 19 it says, "By faith Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, 'It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned.' Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death." So there's your answer. He believed that if he sacrificed him, that God would resurrect him again. So clearly Isaac believed the same. In Hebrews 11:20 it says, "By his faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau, and they're his future sons." So his death would have prevented their birth. So part of the Bible and part of the covenant that was given to Abraham, he was told to bless the next generation. Right? Part of the blessing was to actually have descendants, to have children. And so he would have had to understand this. So as Isaac lay there and looked up, he would have had his father above him with the knife raised above his head to slay him. Isaac, I can imagine that, with the sun beaming and his father up there, he would probably be looking away. I can't imagine he would have been waiting for it to hit. But then just as he was expecting to be struck, he heard an angel of the Lord from heaven call out to his father. And in Genesis 22 verses 11 to 12 says, "Abraham, Abraham." His father paused as he answered, "Here I am." And the angel said to him, "Do not lay a hand on the boy, do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Isaac, I can imagine, would have slumped, relaxing from the tension of waiting for the knife to come down on him. And I imagine his heart rate, which would have been pounding, would have gradually started to subside. So he anticipated being helped down off the altar and having his bindings removed, obviously, because he's thinking, well, that's it. But as Abraham lowered his knife, he saw a ram caught in a thicket nearby. So he helped Isaac off the altar, loosed his bindings. As Isaac freed himself, his father went over to the ram and seized it by the horns. And in Genesis 22:13 it says, "The ram was bound and sacrificed as a burnt offering in his place." So this is where I talk about what the ram was. What do you think the ram was? If you watch a movie or you watch pictures, you usually see something that looks like a merino sheep. If anyone's encountered a merino ram, they are huge. And they're also aggressive. So for Abraham to pop over, grab this ram by the horns, and wrangle it and tie it up and physically lift this thing onto the altar would have actually been an impossibility. He was a 115-year-old man. Okay. So I thought long and hard about this, and I did a bit of research in the Bible, as I like to find out what was actually the ram. And there's actually a whole range of information around it. So I have a picture here, and this is something when we went to Israel that looks like. So this is a ram. It's a slightly young one, but they get full recurved horns, and it's actually an ibex. Okay. Now these ibexes, they stand all of this tall.
Yeah,
They're short. Right? And so we saw them climbing trees, but literally. They put their knees, which are shorter on the front and long on the back, and they literally bend them, and their back half is bent up, and then push themselves up, and they literally go like this. In a couple of seconds, they're right up this tree. So of course, in the land of Israel, in these regions, they had what were called acacia trees, different sizes. So the Bible says that he was caught in a thicket. So it would have been an acacia because guess what? That's what these animals eat. So he would have gone there and had his meal. Now you've got to remember that Jerusalem's high country, hill country. Now when you study about these animals, the male rams are actually solitary. Right? They only go to the herd at mating time. So again we've got this solitary ram, happens to be in a thicket, right? And is in the hill country, fits all of the criteria for how they actually live. Right? Now the other thing is that the animal has to be ceremonially clean. And the Bible gives us a list of which animals are actually determined as ceremonially clean. And lo and behold, this is in Deuteronomy chapter 14 verses 3 to 8. And one of the animals that are ceremonially clean to eat happens to be the ibex. Okay? So they were known as wild goats because of their size, and there's references in the books of Samuel, Psalms, Job, Isaiah and Deuteronomy all about these particular animals. Of course, when David went up to the top of En Gedi, which is one of the places where you can see them today, there was called the crag of the wild goats. And it was again because when they were kids, so when they were little, they actually look just like goats, almost hard to differentiate them. But when they grow older, of course, they grow different horns and you can tell them. So I believe this is what the ram was, and this is what makes it physically possible for a man to physically wrangle one of these things and tie them up. Okay, so the ram was bound and sacrificed as a burnt offering in his place. Isaac heard the angel of the Lord calling his father a second time at this point, and his faithfulness was blessed with God's promise. So in verses 17 to 18 of Genesis 22, it says, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. So again we get another layer of the covenant promise, gets more detail. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. So there's that word, all nations, all people. Not just the descendants of Abraham, who we see as God's chosen people, today we know as the Jewish people, but all people, all races, us, the Gentiles. So we find here, as with God, every time there's a test or there's a stage that develops, God then reveals the next layer of the promise. And so it is for us. When we walk with the Lord, if we're obedient to what God asks us to do, then he reveals what the next thing is to do. If we don't do what he says the first time, we're not going to see the next, the next and the next. Okay, so this is the reality, and same applied for the men. So obviously Isaac returned with his father to where they'd left the servants and set off on their journey back to Beersheba, where Abraham remained. That would have been an interesting conversation on the way home, I would imagine, after all of that. Dad, would you really have done that? You can just imagine. So when Abraham faithfully left his father's household to go to the land of Canaan, God told him in Genesis 12:3 the same thing, all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. When Abraham was faithful, God promised him that through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, as we've just said. So we have that repeat confirmation there. Both of these prophetic promises spoke of the future birth of the Messiah, our Lord Jesus Christ, from whom all people from all nations on earth are blessed.
Yeah.
Okay? So they're already talking of the future Messiah at this point in time. What Isaac did clearly was Christ-like. He went to be sacrificed. He was obedient to God's will, God the Father, and also Abraham, his natural father. He was obedient to both of them. Okay? The scriptures tell us in Hebrews that obviously there was an understanding that Abraham wouldn't actually have to kill his son, but in fact he was being tested. So obviously God was making sure that he would fulfill the covenant. But this is one of the other instances in the Bible where God sends angels to actually make sure that his plan is actually followed through. So this is one of those moments. Okay, so at a later time, Abraham was in Kiriath Arba, which is known as Hebron today, and his wife Sarah passed away. She was aged 127 years old when she passed away. So we can see here the decline of the ages, from the early parts of the Bible right up into the 900s. And he went from his tent to hers to mourn for her. He wept and wept, for he loved her so. Finally rising from beside her, he needed to find a place to bury her, and so he spoke to the Hittites who owned the land in the region where he was staying. Offered to receive some land for free, Abraham refused and chose instead to negotiate with a Hittite called Ephron, who agreed to sell him the deed to a field with a cave in it called Machpelah. This is in Genesis 23, verses 1 to 20. Abraham, who was even older, realised his time was also short, and of course he became concerned for his son Isaac, because he wanted to make sure that he didn't marry a Canaanite woman. God obviously said don't marry, because they were sacrificing children and doing all these other things. He didn't want that influence. So obviously his wife passing away is a marker in his life, saying you've got to consider what's coming next for your son now. So Abraham had received news of how his brother Nahor's family had expanded so much. So his brother Nahor was up in Haran, which is in Turkey today, and he was obviously still in communication with them. There were many children and grandchildren, it tells us in verses 20 to 24 of Genesis 22. He had left Nahor back in Haran with his father Terah many years earlier. So he made one of his servants put his hand under his thigh and said, "Swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that he would not get a wife for Isaac from the daughters of the Canaanites, but get a wife from his own family." Okay, so he's wanting to control the outcome of the influence by marrying within the family at that point in time. So his servant set out from Aram Naharaim, which is northwest Mesopotamia, and made his way to a town called Nahor, funnily enough, that had been named after his brother when he established his home there. Abraham's servant arrived at the town of Nahor with 10 camels. He made them kneel beside the well outside of town, and as dusk drew near, the women from the town came out to draw water for their needs. So again, I've printed a nice picture here for you. It illustrates the Bible. It's from my book. And you can see the ladies coming down to the well, and the camels there in the background. So obviously he's waiting, so it's very specific. So he's actually being told where to go, whom to wait for, what to see, and so he's actually following exactly what he was told to do. As dusk drew near, the women from the town came out to draw water for their needs. Abraham's servant prayed that one of the daughters of the townspeople would respond to his request for water, and then offer to water his camels also, because this is the signal that this was the person that he was to seek. By this means he would know which one had been chosen for Isaac. This came to pass, and Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, who's on your genealogy list there, and granddaughter of Nahor, received permission to leave with her nurse and maids, and she went with Abraham's servant and men. So obviously there was a trust happening because it was family. I can't imagine they knew each other very well, but they were family, so the decision was made that it was appropriate, wasn't it, to get married, yeah. Okay, so the Holy Bible doesn't reveal when it occurred, but Isaac had already moved from his father Abraham to live in the Negev desert near Beer Lahai Roi, which of course is the place where Hagar went when she ran away when she was pregnant, and there's a well there. So just remember all the places that they go to, because they've got livestock, they always need water. So it's a barren place today, but back then it wasn't. It had this water that was there. So that can be found, the location is in Genesis 24:62 and Genesis 25 verse 11. So Isaac had just returned from Beer Lahai Roi in the south of the Negev desert and was staying with his father at Beersheba. He had gone out into the field to meditate one night when he noticed a train of camels. Rebekah was on one of these camels when she too noticed him in the field. Okay, so I have one last picture to pass around. This is the way they actually used to dress and how they used to actually carry the camels. And they had these pods on the back where they were there to protect them from the elements. You can see Rebekah on the first lead camel, poking her head out from her comfort on the camel. Okay, so Rebecca was on one of these camels when she too noticed him in the field. Asking who he was, Abraham's servant told her that this was Isaac, the man she had been brought to marry. The servant met with Isaac and explained all that had transpired. So Isaac brought her to his mother's tent and married her. So it was a pretty quick transaction, wasn't it? But you notice there, I don't know if you noticed in all of this, he said her mother's tent and married her. There's actually gender separated tents. Okay, so Abraham had his own tent and Sarah used to have her own tent. So when they're in Beersheba here, it says that they went to the mother's tent and married her. So women were actually courted separately to the men. Okay, so a bit like the old harem, isn't it? Like we talked about. So the Bible gives us a good insight, we read it carefully, into what life was actually like through some of those bits of information. So Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebecca, who was the daughter of Bethuel the Aramean from Paddan Aram, and sister of Laban the Aramean. So that's in Genesis 25 verses 19 to 20. So it identifies who she is, what her genealogy is. So away to the east means on the other side of the Jordan River, so in today's Jordan. Right, so you've been brought up, love your kids, here's a present, off you go. Okay, so he was always mindful first and foremost that he fulfilled the covenant that he had with God. So he was making sure there was no issues there. Like Isaac's mother Sarah, Rebecca was also barren and unable to conceive a child. So we have this repeat story of the next generation. So Isaac had been married to Rebecca for 20 years, but she had been unable to fall pregnant. But unlike his father Abraham, Isaac did not lay with a maidservant to have a son, for that would fall short of God's covenant. His faith was strong. This is the boy who laid down on the altar. Yeah. So his faith was strong. So compared with his father who first met God and had gone on this journey to prepare his faith, this is the generation change, isn't it? Isaac had been brought up with this faith. So for him it was easier, right, in terms of his faith, because that's what he learned from his parents. And so that's what we're called to do with our own children. So we see this exhibited right back in this early times. So he interceded in prayer for his wife. So that was his answer, that was his solution. Not to go ahead and do something in the natural, but to actually pray and intercede for his wife to be able to fall pregnant. So his prayer was answered. Rebecca not only became pregnant, but she was blessed with twins. And as the twins grew within her, they struggled with each other in her womb, causing great concern. She asked God why. So in Genesis chapter 25, verse 23, the Lord said, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. Okay? So from this, so this word that was spoken before the children was born, it tells you who was going to inherit the covenant, who was going to be the stronger. And it wasn't the firstborn child, again, which inheritance normally works by, but in fact it was the second. Okay. So Rebecca gave birth to 2 boys. The first she named Esau. Does anyone remember what Esau means?
Red.
Red.
Hairy.
Oh, hairy.
And red.
That's the red hair.
Yeah. But hairy, because he was, and the Bible tells us, he was reddish in colour and hairy. Must have been a Scotsman. The second, as God said, was born holding tightly onto the heel of the first. So she named him Jacob, because Jacob means
Heel?
he who grasps the heel. So we use these names today, and they're quite funny when we look at the origins of them, aren't they? So it says, he who grasps. So if you name your son Jacob, you're saying you're the child who grabs the heel of the previous child. So as the boys grew up and matured, the Bible tells us, however, that they were very different to each other. Esau became a skillful hunter. Genesis chapter 25 verse 27. Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was a quiet man, staying among the tents. And Isaac, who loved to eat wild game, loved Esau, while Rebekah loved Jacob. So we see a division in the family already. Right, we have a preference of the children in terms of how they like to live, and then we have a preference of the parents with which child they prefer based on how they chose to live. So when the two boys were 15 and Isaac was 75 years of age, this is the time that Abraham finally passed away. Okay? He was 175 years old and he left everything to Isaac. Okay? So as we say, we're no longer having anyone aged greater than 200 anymore. Okay, so he outlived his wife obviously quite a few years, had more family, but died at 175, yeah, that's right. Okay, so the chief servant in Abraham's household sent messengers to Isaac and his estranged brother Ishmael, saying their father Abraham, and the Bible tells us in Genesis 25 verse 8, had been gathered to his people. So when you read the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, if it says anywhere that someone's been gathered to their people, it basically means that they have passed away. That's what it means. Okay. So that means to their people who came before them, they've gone with them. Okay, so both Isaac and Ishmael came to Beersheba to mourn their beloved father, and together they journeyed with their father's body, leading their families and servants northwards. Again, they would have gone up the way to Shur, to the plot of land which Abraham had bought, and they buried Abraham in the cave of Machpelah and reunited him with his wife Sarah. That's in today's Hebron. So travelling back south, Isaac and Ishmael would have parted company again. Ishmael went to his home in the desert of Paran, and Isaac, after receiving his inheritance, to where he'd been living in Beer Lahai Roi. It says in Genesis 25 verse 11, after Abraham's death, God blessed his son Isaac, who then lived near Beer Lahai Roi. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this lesson, because yes, I know.
Oh, you
It's
want
like,
more?
wow.
Come on.
So this week, and you might remember I said to you last week that the story of Isaac
Sure.
Yeah, we should.
is actually short, because most of his story is actually in interaction with his father Abraham. Of course, he gets married, which is organised by his father Abraham, and here it says he heads off to the desert with his wife. When we go into the next part of the Bible, the story really jumps across to the story of when he has his children, and it talks about what happens between Esau and Jacob, because this is what's just been introduced here. So Isaac's individual story in the Bible isn't very eventful, other than the fact that he was very Christ-like. You know, he was willing to go to the altar, and so he obviously knew the Lord, and he was obedient to the Lord.